My ex-husband filed for divorce with a smug smile, telling me he was taking absolutely everything. The $4 million mansion, the luxury cars, and the entire investment firm. My lawyer screamed at me over the phone, begging me to fight back and not let him win. But I calmly signed the papers without shedding a single tear. He celebrated for a whole week in my house with his mistress. Until the final court hearing, when the judge looked at the deed and asked about one hidden financial clause. My ex-husband nearly collapsed on the courtroom floor. My name is Justine, and I am 34 years old. I work as a corporate restructuring executive, completely self-made from the ground up. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic people who underestimated your worth. Growing up working class taught me that nobody hands you anything for free in this world. You have to build it brick by brick with your own hands. And I built an absolute empire. But inside my sprawling $4 million mansion, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. The house, with its manicured lawn and imported Italian finishes, was a fortress of expectations I had funded entirely on my own. I had just returned from a grueling 2-week corporate restructuring trip in London. My body was completely exhausted from navigating international mergers and hostile takeovers across different time zones. The private black car service dropped me off at my front gate. The heavy wrought iron gate swung open, revealing the massive stone driveway of the estate I paid for with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I pulled my designer luggage up the front steps, just wanting a hot shower and a quiet evening. I unlocked the custom mahogany front door, expecting the quiet sanctuary of an empty house. Instead, I walked directly into an orchestrated ambush. The expansive living room was bathed in the warm glow of the modern crystal chandelier. Sitting right in the center of my imported Italian leather sofa was my husband DeAndre. He was 36 years old and liked to call himself a real estate mogul among his peers. In reality, he was a man who played pretend, using my corporate bank accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle. He was wearing expensive silk loungewear, looking like he had not lifted a finger to work in a decade. In his hand was a crystal glass filled with my most expensive vintage wine, a bottle I had been carefully saving for a major corporate milestone. He did not get up to greet me when I walked in. He did not ask about my long international flight or my intense 2 weeks of high-stakes business negotiations. He simply took a slow, arrogant sip of the red wine and stared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated entitlement. I set my luggage down by the grand entryway, feeling the sudden heavy tension radiating through the room. DeAndre leaned forward and slid a thick stack of legal documents across the pristine glass coffee table. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the glass echoed loudly in the silent room. I did not immediately reach for them. I stood perfectly still, maintaining my posture as a corporate executive assessing a highly volatile situation. I noticed his posture was entirely too confident for a man who had never successfully closed a commercial deal without my direct financial intervention. DeAndre looked me dead in the eye and stated coldly that he was completely exhausted by our marriage. He claimed he was totally drained by my masculine, bossy energy. He told me that my relentless ambition and my constant need to dominate the corporate world made him feel utterly emasculated in his own home. He said he needed a woman who was soft and traditional, a woman who knew her proper place and did not constantly challenge his authority every time he tried to make a business decision. Then he tapped his manicured finger aggressively against the stack of papers. He declared that those were official divorce papers and he expected a swift resolution without any drawn-out legal battles. He demanded 100% ownership of the $4 million mansion we were currently sitting in, claiming he needed it to maintain his social status. He demanded full ownership of the 2 luxury vehicles parked in the garage, which I paid the expensive monthly leases on. And most outrageously, he demanded complete and absolute control of the investment firm called Apex Holdings, LLC. I had legally structured that company and allowed him to hold the title of Chief Executive Officer purely to stroke his incredibly fragile ego. He genuinely believed that holding the fake title meant he actually owned the empire I had meticulously built from the ground up. Before I could even formulate a response to his monumental audacity, The heavy double doors leading to the formal dining room swung open. The ambush was entirely premeditated and highly coordinated. Parading into my living room was my husband's mother, Brenda, followed closely by his sister, Ebony, and Ebony's white husband, Gavin. Brenda carried herself with the self-righteous arrogance of a woman who spent all her time judging others at her high society church functions. She was 62 years old and had always despised my working-class roots. She constantly bragged about her family having elite legacy bloodlines, even though she lived entirely off the generous allowance I provided to DeAndre every single month. Her entire social persona was funded by my paycheck, yet she looked at me as if I was the hired help intruding on her private estate. Brenda crossed her arms over her chest and looked me up and down with absolute disgust. She loudly proclaimed that her son was finally freeing himself from a sterile corporate machine. She told me that their prominent family needed a traditional nurturing woman who actually cared about family values instead of profit margins and boardroom meetings. She instructed me to sign the papers immediately and take my aggressive, unrefined behavior back to the poor, working-class neighborhood I originally came from. She said my money could never buy true class and that I was fundamentally unfit for a man of DeAndre's sophisticated pedigree. She claimed my career was destroying her son's potential and that I was nothing but a toxic roadblock to his ultimate destiny as a wealthy real estate developer. Ebony stood right behind her mother, nodding in aggressive agreement, holding a designer handbag that I knew, for an absolute fact, was purchased using a secondary credit card, tied directly to my personal corporate account. Ebony was a 32-year-old woman who had never held a steady job, relying entirely on her brother to funnel my money into her bank account so she could maintain the illusion of being a wealthy socialite. She chimed in, adding that DeAndre deserved absolute peace and a wife who actually respected his position as a powerful businessman. She said I was too cold, too calculating, and completely devoid of the feminine grace required to run a high society household. She told me I should be embarrassed that my husband had to file for divorce just to escape my overbearing presence. But the absolute peak of the disrespect came from Gavin. Gavin was a 34-year-old day trader who consistently lost thousands of dollars on the stock market every single month. He lived entirely off the financial grace of my success, yet he operated with an unearned superiority complex that made my blood boil. Gavin casually strolled over to my custom-built home bar, completely ignoring the gravity of the tense situation. He bypassed the cheaper bottles and poured himself a generous glass of my rarest, most expensive aged bourbon. He took a long, slow sip, kicked his feet back, and looked at me with a sickeningly condescending smirk on his pale face. Gavin told me to calm down and warned me not to act like an angry black woman. The sheer racial and classist audacity of his statement hung heavily in the air. He stood in the beautiful house my money paid for, drinking expensive liquor my hard work bought, and had the absolute nerve to try and put me in my place. He laughed a harsh, mocking sound and told me that my relentless hustle culture energy never truly fit into their elite neighborhood anyway. He suggested that people who had to aggressively grind for their money lacked the natural, effortless elegance of true old money families. He said I was far too loud, too ambitious, and too focused on money, making the entire family completely uncomfortable with my aggressive presence. He took another sip of my bourbon and told me to just sign the legal documents, give DeAndre the assets he rightly deserved for putting up with my difficult personality, and walk away quietly before things got too hostile. He said I should be grateful they were even allowing me to leave with my dignity intact. He claimed DeAndre was being incredibly generous by not going after my future earnings, since he had sacrificed so much of his own potential dealing with my demanding corporate lifestyle. Gavin spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who contributed absolutely nothing to society, but felt completely entitled to judge the woman actively paying for the roof over his head. I stood amidst the ruins of my marriage, looking at the four people who had happily leeched off my success for years. They expected me to break down completely right there in the entryway. They wanted me to scream, to cry, to beg for my home, or to physically fight them for my hard-earned assets. They desperately wanted the angry, emotional woman stereotype they could later use to justify their cruelty to their friends and extended family. They wanted me to look unhinged so they could validate their false narrative that I was emotionally unstable and unfit for their precious son. But I am a highly trained corporate restructuring executive. I spend my days dismantling hostile negotiations and navigating multi-million-dollar crisis management situations across global markets. I do not throw tantrums. I execute hostile takeovers and systematic liquidations with absolute precision. I looked around the luxury living room that I had entirely funded with my own blood, sweat, and tears, taking in every expensive detail they were trying to steal from me. My expression slowly shifted from a brief moment of heartbreak to cold, ruthless calculation as I stared at the divorce papers resting on the glass table, evaluating the exact depth of the trap they had just willingly walked into. Just as the heavy, suffocating arrogance of my husband's family filled the room, the situation somehow managed to escalate into an entirely new dimension of absolute disrespect. I heard the soft padding of bare feet against the imported hardwood floors of the grand staircase. I slowly turned my head and watched as a 26-year-old woman named Monique gracefully descended the steps. Monique was a Pilates instructor whom DeAndre had allegedly hired to help him get in shape for a charity gala a few months ago. Now she was parading through my $4 million mansion, acting as if she had just won the ultimate high society lottery. But what truly made my blood run cold for a fraction of a second was what she was wearing. Monique was wrapped tightly in my custom-tailored emerald green silk robe. It was a handcrafted garment I had personally commissioned during a business trip to Milan, complete with my own initials elegantly embroidered in gold thread on the breast pocket. She strutted down the staircase, trailing her hand along the custom iron banister, looking down at me with the vacant, smug expression of a woman who genuinely believed she had just secured a lifetime of effortless wealth. Before I could even address the absolute audacity of this young woman wearing my intimate clothing in my own home, Brenda immediately stepped forward to shield her. My mother-in-law threw her arms open in a protective maternal gesture toward the mistress standing at the bottom of the stairs. Brenda raised her voice, ensuring that every word echoed off the high ceilings of my living room. She loudly declared that her son had finally found a woman who knew how to truly cater to a powerful man. Brenda looked at me with venom in her eyes and stated that their prominent legacy family desperately needed a traditional nurturing woman who could provide warmth and domestic peace. She pointed a manicured finger at me and yelled that I was nothing but a sterile corporate machine who only cared about profit margins and hostile takeovers. She claimed that my obsession with my career had driven her poor son into the arms of a younger, softer woman who actually understood the fundamental value of making a man feel like a king in his own castle. Brenda justified her son's blatant infidelity by twisting the narrative completely, making me the villain for being a highly successful provider, while elevating a 26-year-old fitness instructor to the status of a savior. My personal mobile phone was currently sitting on the glass coffee table right next to the towering stack of divorce papers. It was completely lighting up with an incoming call from my aggressive divorce attorney. DeAndre had apparently sent a courtesy copy of these ridiculous demands to my legal team just an hour before springing this ambush on me. I answered the call and put it directly on speakerphone. My lawyer was absolutely screaming through the audio receiver. His voice was frantic and furious, echoing loudly into the living room. He begged me not to sign a single page. He yelled that DeAndre's demands were completely absurd and mathematically completely unhinged. He told me to fight back, to drag this out in court, and to absolutely destroy them in litigation so they would not get a single dime of my hard-earned corporate wealth. DeAndre, Brenda, and Ebony all tensed up, hearing the aggressive legal advice, assuming I was about to unleash a massive, expensive legal war that would tie up my assets for years. But I completely ignored my frantic lawyer. I reached forward and ended the call, silencing his screaming voice with a single tap of my finger. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream or throw my luggage or give them the satisfaction of watching a successful Black woman break down into an emotional wreck. I simply picked up the thick stack of legal documents and began to read them with the exact same clinical detachment I use when analyzing a failing corporate entity. I flipped through the pages, scanning the ridiculous demands for alimony, the demands for the luxury vehicles, and the demands for the primary estate. But my eyes stopped and locked entirely onto one very specific, highly detailed clause buried in the center of the financial separation agreement. DeAndre was aggressively and explicitly demanding absolute sole ownership of the investment firm known as Apex Holdings, LLC. He had instructed his incredibly foolish lawyers to draft ironclad language, ensuring that I would forfeit any and all future claims to that specific holding company, granting him 100% unadulterated executive control. He sat there on my couch, swirling his wine, looking at me with a smug, triumphant grin. He genuinely believed he had just checkmated a master corporate strategist. He thought Apex Holdings LLC was the golden goose that held the deed to the mansion and the keys to his future as a billionaire real estate mogul. He had absolutely no idea that he was actively demanding the keys to a financial slaughterhouse. I looked at the documents, and then I looked at the 5 parasitic people standing in my living room, eagerly waiting for my downfall. I let a slow, cold, chilling smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that rarely reaches the eyes, the kind of smile a predator offers, right before the trap violently snaps shut. I reached into my designer handbag, pulled out my favorite heavy gold fountain pen, and smoothly uncapped it. I leaned over the glass coffee table and signed my name on the dotted line with flawless, elegant strokes. I initialed every single page exactly where his foolish lawyers requested. I signed away the $4 million mansion. I signed away the luxury vehicles. And most importantly, I signed away 100% of Apex Holdings, LLC, handing him absolute sole ownership of the company. I placed the pen down and pushed the finalized legally binding documents back across the table toward a completely stunned DeAndre. He blinked rapidly, totally unable to comprehend why the notoriously ruthless corporate executive he had married just willingly surrendered her entire fortune without a single argument. The confusion quickly melted into pure, unadulterated, arrogant joy. He grabbed the papers, clutching them to his chest like a winning lottery ticket. Monique ran over and threw her arms around his neck, squealing with delight, while Brenda raised her hands in the air, praising the Lord for delivering her son to the promised land. I did not wait around to watch their pathetic premature celebration. I turned my back on the entire room and walked calmly up the sweeping grand staircase. I passed right by Monique, who quickly shrank back against the wall, intimidated by the sheer, unbothered power radiating from my silence. I walked into the sprawling master bedroom, a space that now felt entirely contaminated by their presence. I did not pack my extensive collection of designer clothes or my expensive shoes. I knew I could replace every single fabric item in this house with a single day's pay. I went straight to the hidden wall safe behind the vanity mirror. I rapidly punched in my secure access code and retrieved only what truly mattered. I packed a single sturdy leather suitcase with my high-end jewelry collection, my essential legal passports, my secure financial hard drives, and my corporate work laptop. I moved with absolute mechanical efficiency, leaving behind everything that was superficial or easily replaceable. I zipped the leather suitcase shut and walked back out into the upstairs hallway. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed a highly exclusive direct line to my primary wealth management bank. As I descended the staircase carrying my single piece of luggage, I could hear the loud, obnoxious laughter echoing from the living room. Gavin was currently pouring himself another glass of my expensive bourbon, toasting to DeAndre's massive real estate victory. I reached the bottom of the stairs and placed the phone to my ear, speaking in a low, steady, authoritative tone. I bypassed the automated system and spoke directly to my personal portfolio manager. I instructed him to initiate an immediate total lockdown on every single secondary credit account attached to my primary corporate profile. I explicitly told him to permanently deactivate the platinum and black cards currently issued under the names of DeAndre, Brenda, and Ebony. I ordered that all lines of credit be instantly severed with zero grace period and absolutely no authorization for emergency overdrafts. The timing was so flawlessly poetic, it felt almost orchestrated by a divine hand. Just as I reached the grand entryway of the mansion to retrieve my designer luggage, a sharp, loud buzzing sound pierced through the celebratory noise in the living room. Ebony, who had been busy scrolling through her phone on the velvet love seat, suddenly let out a confused, irritated gasp. She stared down at her glowing screen, her manicured fingers aggressively tapping the glass. She announced to the room that she had just received an urgent automated text message from the bank. The notification explicitly stated that the exclusive black card she was currently using to purchase $5,000 worth of designer handbags online had been permanently and irrevocably deactivated due to primary account holder termination. The loud, obnoxious laughter in the living room died instantly. The celebratory atmosphere evaporated in a matter of seconds, completely replaced by a sudden creeping wave of financial panic. Ebony looked up from her phone, staring directly at me with wide, terrified eyes. Brenda immediately reached into her own designer purse, scrambling to check her banking application on her phone to see if her endless supply of my money had also been abruptly cut off. Gavin slowly lowered his glass of bourbon, the color draining from his pale face, as he realized his free ride had just violently crashed into a brick wall. I stood by the custom mahogany front door, holding my single leather suitcase, and looking back at the group of parasites who thought they had just conquered my empire. I offered them one final chillingly polite smile. I looked directly at Ebony and Gavin, who were suddenly realizing they had absolutely no way to pay for their extravagant lifestyle. I told them in a calm, cheerful customer service voice that from this exact second forward, they would have to figure out how to pay the rent for their luxury downtown apartment all by themselves. I wished Gavin the absolute best of luck with his deeply unprofitable day trading career. I then looked at DeAndre, who was still clutching the signed divorce papers tightly against his chest. I told him to enjoy the new mansion and his new soft, nurturing Pilates instructor. I reminded him that running a $4 million estate was highly expensive work, and I sincerely hoped his new role as the sole owner of Apex Holdings LLC would bring him exactly what he deserved. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the crisp evening air. I did not look back over my shoulder a single time. I walked down the stone driveway toward the private black car service that was already waiting to take me back to the city. I left them standing in the grand living room surrounded by empty luxury, completely oblivious to the fact that the financial guillotine they had just eagerly pulled the lever on was currently suspended directly over their own necks, just waiting for gravity to do its job. The smooth leather seats of the private black car offered a quiet sanctuary as the sprawling $4 million mansion disappeared in the rearview mirror. I leaned my head against the tinted glass, watching the city lights of Atlanta blur into a continuous stream of bright illumination. The driver remained perfectly silent, respecting the heavy atmosphere of the evening. DeAndre and his parasitic family truly believed that my swift departure was a sign of ultimate defeat. They thought they had executed a flawless ambush to steal my wealth and humiliate me in my own home. What they did not understand was that I had been methodically orchestrating their absolute destruction for the past 18 months. The origin of this beautiful financial trap began exactly a year and a half ago, during an unusually warm afternoon in early spring. I had returned home early from a grueling corporate strategy conference in Chicago. The massive house was completely empty, but DeAndre's personal laptop was left open and unlocked on the kitchen island. I am not a woman who snoops through personal devices, but a bright notification banner flashed across the high-definition screen that immediately caught my attention. It was a highly explicit message from a 26-year-old Pilates instructor named Monique, thanking him for a lavish weekend getaway at a luxury resort in Miami. The dates of the romantic trip perfectly aligned with a weekend DeAndre claimed he was attending an intensive real estate networking seminar for aspiring Black entrepreneurs. I stood in the pristine kitchen reading the disgusting details of their affair and looking at the digital receipts of the expensive gifts he had purchased for her using funds that I had deposited into his account. Most women would have immediately confronted their husband. They would have screamed, thrown his expensive designer belongings onto the front lawn, and demanded a divorce right then and there. They would have called his mother and exposed his infidelity to the entire family. But I did not shed a single tear. I did not break a single glass. I simply stood in my immaculate kitchen and stared at the glowing screen with absolute cold clarity. In the high-stakes corporate world, when a highly valued asset becomes fundamentally corrupted, you do not throw a chaotic emotional tantrum. You quietly initiate a comprehensive forensic audit. You isolate the liability, and you begin the meticulous process of a systematic liquidation. My marriage was no longer a loving partnership. It was a profoundly toxic failing business entity that needed to be aggressively dismantled from the inside out. I knew exactly who DeAndre was at his very core. He was a profoundly insecure man who masked his deep feelings of inadequacy with loud, arrogant displays of fake wealth. He desperately wanted to be perceived as a powerful high society real estate mogul among his elite fraternity brothers in Atlanta. He spent hours listening to hustle culture podcasts and regurgitating meaningless business buzzwords. But he fundamentally lacked the actual discipline, intellect, and drive required to build a legitimate enterprise. His entire identity was entirely dependent on the financial foundation I had built for him. I knew that if I simply divorced him, he would play the victim. He would drag me through a messy, public legal battle in the local courts, demanding spousal support and half of my hard-earned assets. I needed a brilliant strategy that would compel him to willingly sign away his right to my future wealth, while simultaneously taking on massive, catastrophic debt. To catch a greedy parasite, you have to offer it a magnificent host. The bait had to be perfectly tailored to his massive, fragile ego. 2 weeks after discovering the affair, I scheduled a private dinner at an exclusive high-end restaurant downtown. I ordered an expensive bottle of vintage wine and looked across the candlelit table at the man who was actively betraying me with a Pilates instructor. I put on a flawless performance of a supportive, submissive wife. I told DeAndre that I had been doing a lot of deep personal reflection about our marriage and his undeniable potential as a prominent businessman. I apologized for my masculine, bossy energy and told him that I wanted to take a step back and let him lead our family to generational wealth. I stroked his ego until he was practically glowing with unearned pride. I pulled out a sleek leather portfolio and slid it across the table. Inside were the official state incorporation documents for a brand new commercial entity named Apex Holdings, LLC. I watched his eyes widen as he read the crisp legal paperwork. I explained that this company was my ultimate anniversary gift to him. I told him that I had utilized my extensive corporate legal connections to establish a premium real estate investment firm designed specifically to launch his empire. And the most important detail of all was that the company listed DeAndre as the absolute sole chief executive officer. He would have complete, unadulterated executive control over all corporate decisions without ever needing my signature or my approval. The transformation in his posture was instantaneous and entirely pathetic to witness. He sat up straighter, puffing out his chest and adjusting his expensive designer watch. He eagerly grabbed my heavy gold pen and signed the incorporation documents, genuinely believing that his inherent brilliance had finally been recognized by his overbearing wife. He did not bother to read the fine print or consult with his own legal counsel, because his overwhelming narcissism completely blinded him to the possibility of a trap. He assumed I was finally submitting to his ultimate authority. He spent the rest of the dinner bragging about his grandiose visions for commercial developments and luxury high-rises, completely oblivious to the fact that I was quietly studying him, like a lab rat wandering into a maze. But simply giving him a hollow company with a fancy name was not enough to spring the ultimate trap. An empty shell company carries no actual weight, and more importantly, It carries no collateral. To make the trap lethal, the company needed a massive, highly valuable asset to anchor its portfolio. A few months later, I approached DeAndre with the second phase of my meticulous plan. I told him that in order for Apex Holdings LLC to be taken seriously by major investors and commercial lenders, the firm needed significant real estate assets on its official balance sheet. I proposed a highly sophisticated tax strategy that I claimed my corporate accountants had highly recommended. I suggested that we legally transfer the deed of our sprawling $4 million mansion directly into the sole ownership of Apex Holdings, LLC. I explained that by housing our primary residence within his corporate entity, he could leverage its immense value to secure massive lines of credit and operate like a true real estate titan in the Atlanta market. The sheer greed and arrogance in his eyes blinded him completely to any potential risk. He was absolutely thrilled by the idea of being the sole executive officer of a company that held a $4 million physical asset. We met with a public notary the very next day. I calmly signed the transfer documents, legally relinquishing my personal individual ownership of the estate and moving the property entirely into the hands of his company. DeAndre was practically vibrating with excitement. He grabbed the finalized deed and kissed my cheek, calling me the greatest, most supportive wife in the world. He then immediately left the house to meet Monique, likely bragging to his young mistress about his incredible new status as a self-made millionaire real estate mogul who had just outsmarted his wealthy wife. For the next 12 months, I sat back in absolute silence and watched the fraudulent illusion take total control of his life. I allowed him to parade around the wealthy, upscale neighborhoods of Atlanta, acting like a modern-day titan of industry. He started hosting lavish networking events at the mansion, billing them as exclusive corporate retreats for Apex Holdings, LLC. He invited his fraternity brothers, his church friends, and local politicians, offering them expensive cigars and pouring my vintage liquor. He stood in the grand entryway of the home I had purchased with my own corporate bonuses and proudly proclaimed to his guests that it was the absolute crown jewel of his growing real estate portfolio. He was living a complete lie funded entirely by my patience and his own profound stupidity. Brenda was equally intoxicated by the fraudulent illusion of her son's massive success. She paraded through her high society church functions, bragging loudly about DeAndre's massive corporate firm and his brilliant mind for commercial acquisitions. She told anyone who would listen that her son had finally stepped out of my overbearing shadow and was building a beautiful generational legacy for their elite bloodline. She started treating me with even more disdain, openly criticizing my simple tailored business suits, while she flaunted designer handbags purchased with the secondary credit cards I provided for her. She told her church friends that I was just a lucky woman riding the coattails of her visionary son. I accepted their relentless insults with a calm, pleasant smile. Every single time they mocked my work ethic or insulted my working-class background, I simply reminded myself of the beautiful, highly sophisticated legal death trap they were currently dancing inside. They were all completely intoxicated by the fake reality I had meticulously constructed for them. They saw the luxury cars, the massive mansion, and the fancy corporate title, but they fundamentally lacked the financial literacy to understand the invisible strings attached to every single asset. DeAndre was so desperately eager to play the role of the wealthy boss that he never bothered to actually look under the hood of the company he supposedly owned. He never hired an independent financial auditor. He never reviewed the long-term tax implications or the corporate liability structures. He simply accepted the shiny keys to the kingdom without ever questioning why the previous ruler was so willing to casually walk away from the throne. He was entirely unaware that while he was busy playing the role of a fake millionaire, I was meeting quietly in dimly lit boardrooms with aggressive private equity managers and forensic accountants. I was using my extensive corporate network to arrange the final devastating phase of the restructuring plan. I had built a beautiful golden cage for my husband and locked him safely inside it. The mansion and the company were not a generous gift. They were the heavy concrete blocks I had securely chained to his ankles before throwing him into the deep end of a very dark ocean. I watched him swim proudly around the shallow end, completely oblivious to the fact that the water was slowly, steadily, and inevitably draining away. He thought he had successfully conquered my empire, but he had actually just signed his own financial death warrant and eagerly handed me the pen to finalize the execution. The private black car pulled up to the discreet rear entrance of a highly exclusive members-only club located deep in the financial district of Atlanta. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked through the unmarked doors, entering a dimly lit, sophisticated space that catered specifically to the city's most ruthless corporate titans and aggressive wealth managers. I was not there to socialize or network. I was there to finalize the execution parameters of the most devastating financial trap I had ever engineered. Sitting in a secluded, curved leather booth at the very back of the private lounge was Donovan. Donovan was a 38-year-old African-American forensic accountant and the managing director of a highly aggressive shadow private equity firm. He was dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, his demeanor radiating the quiet, terrifying power of a man who specialized in legally dismantling corporate empires and liquidating assets for massive profits. I slid into the leather booth directly across from him. Donovan did not offer a warm greeting or unnecessary small talk. He simply took a slow, deliberate sip of his aged bourbon and slid a thick black legal binder across the polished mahogany table. The binder contained the absolute financial destruction of my ex-husband. We began to meticulously review the precise mechanics of the commercial mezzanine loan we had orchestrated together exactly 1 year ago. A mezzanine loan is a highly complex and incredibly dangerous hybrid of debt and equity financing. It is typically reserved for serious commercial real estate acquisitions executed by highly experienced corporate entities. It is absolutely not the kind of financial instrument a fragile, insecure man like DeAndre should ever have access to. But I had intentionally fed his massive, fragile ego. I had spent months convincing him that in order to truly be viewed as a high society real estate mogul among his elite peers, he needed to leverage his existing assets to secure massive institutional funding. I had introduced DeAndre to Donovan under the strict guise of a prestigious exclusive networking opportunity. Donovan had played his part to absolute terrifying perfection. He sat in a high-rise boardroom with DeAndre stroking his fragile ego, praising his highly mediocre business pitch, and acting profoundly impressed by his fake hustle culture persona. Donovan formally offered DeAndre's empty shell company Apex Holdings, LLC, a staggering $5.5 million commercial loan. The stated purpose of the massive capital was to supposedly expand his real estate empire and allow him to purchase a diverse portfolio of luxury commercial properties across the city. DeAndre was so completely blinded by the massive zeros on the contract and his own desperate, endless greed that he never once stopped to question why a ruthless private equity firm was so eager to hand him millions of dollars. He eagerly, enthusiastically signed the preliminary financial documents. He genuinely believed he was a self-made titan of industry, finally making the biggest corporate deal of his entire life without his wife's assistance. But there was a brilliant, heavily calculated catch deeply embedded in the paperwork. Donovan calmly explained to DeAndre that while the $4 million mansion currently held by Apex Holdings, LLC, was a beautiful, tangible asset, it was not entirely sufficient to fully underwrite the immense risk of a $5.5 million commercial loan. The private equity firm strictly required additional hard collateral to legally secure the massive debt. They needed another highly valuable piece of real estate to legally back the financial transaction before they would release a single dime of the funding. This was the exact precise moment the trap was perfectly laid for my horrific mother-in-law. DeAndre was absolutely desperate to close the massive deal. He could already taste the fake prestige of being a multimillionaire commercial developer, but he completely lacked the secondary personal assets required to satisfy the strict underwriting conditions of the shadow equity firm. I subtly, casually planted the toxic idea in his empty head during a quiet, tense dinner at home. I casually mentioned that true old money legacy families always pooled their generational resources to build their massive, untouchable empires. I suggested that if his mother truly believed in his elite bloodline and his ultimate destiny as a wealthy businessman, she should be more than willing to financially back his visionary corporate expansion. DeAndre took the bait immediately and swallowed the sharp hook whole. He went directly to Brenda and pitched her the incredibly dangerous, highly volatile financial arrangement. Brenda was a woman entirely consumed by her fake high society church image and her desperate, pathetic need to constantly brag about her son's elite status. She wanted nothing more than to walk into her Sunday service and tell all the other wealthy matriarchs that she was a powerful, silent partner in her son's massive real estate firm. Moreover, she saw this as the ultimate opportunity to prove that she was the true supportive matriarch of the family, directly undermining my role as his primary financial provider. She eagerly, enthusiastically agreed to help him secure the massive institutional funding. Brenda blindly signed a highly complex, lethal legal document known as a cross-collateralization agreement. She legally put the deed to her own fully paid-off suburban home entirely on the line. She willingly offered up her only primary residence as direct hard collateral to back her son's massive high-risk business venture. She did not hire an independent lawyer to review the dense paperwork. She did not read the microscopic fine print detailing the extreme absolute liabilities. She simply signed her name on the dotted line, completely unaware that she had just eagerly handed the executioner's axe directly to me. DeAndre took the $5.5 million and immediately did exactly what I knew he would do. He squandered the entire massive sum with spectacular, unforgivable incompetence. He purchased a massive strip of dead commercial real estate on the outskirts of the city that generated absolutely zero revenue. He bought the highly toxic assets purely because he wanted to see his fake company name on a giant billboard overlooking the interstate highway. He burned through the operating capital trying to renovate neglected properties that were fundamentally worthless. Within 12 months, the loan money was entirely gone, leaving Apex Holdings LLC with nothing but massive, staggering, unpayable debt, and the collateralized homes keeping the corporate entity barely on life support. Donovan opened the thick black binder and pointed his finger to a specific, highly technical clause buried deep within the 50-page commercial contract. It was the absolute ultimate poison pill. The $5.5 million loan agreement contained a highly aggressive and completely non-negotiable acceleration clause. An acceleration clause is a terrifying financial legal mechanism that legally allows the aggressive lender to demand immediate and total repayment of the entire outstanding debt balance if certain specific strict conditions are met. Donovan read the exact legal phrasing out loud, his deep voice dripping with cold, professional amusement. The contract explicitly stated that if the marital structure of the primary stakeholders undergoes any legal dissolution, or if the chief executive officer assumes 100% unadulterated control of the collateralized asset via a divorce settlement, the entire $5.5 million debt instantly fully matures. The legal terminology was an absolute flawless masterpiece of targeted corporate destruction. It meant there was absolutely no payment plan available to the debtor. There was no 30-day grace period to scramble and find alternative funding. There was no opportunity to refinance or negotiate a desperate restructuring of the massive debt. The very exact microsecond that the presiding family court judge slams his heavy gavel and officially signs the final divorce decree, transferring absolute sole ownership of Apex Holdings, LLC, directly to DeAndre, the massive commercial loan goes into immediate catastrophic default. DeAndre would instantly automatically owe Donovan's shadow equity firm $5.5 million in cold hard cash payable immediately upon formal demand. And if the monumental debt was not completely satisfied within 7 business days, the private equity firm possessed the absolute legal right to aggressively seize and swiftly liquidate all attached collateral to recover their lost funds. The impending financial destruction was mathematically absolute. They would not just foreclose on the beautiful $4 million mansion that DeAndre fought so hard to aggressively steal from me. The ironclad cross-collateralization agreement meant that Donovan's aggressive asset recovery team would also legally seize and immediately liquidate Brenda's fully paid-off home. The arrogant, toxic matriarch who had thrown a massive, disrespectful fit in my living room and loudly called me a sterile corporate machine was going to be completely and legally evicted from her own longtime property. She was going to be entirely homeless, all because she blindly trusted her parasitic, incompetent son to manage a highly volatile corporate debt structure he fundamentally could not comprehend. I sat in the dim lighting of the private exclusive lounge, taking a slow sip of my water as the sheer magnitude of the impending total devastation washed over me. Right at this very exact moment, DeAndre and his new younger mistress, Monique, were likely celebrating their false absolute victory inside the sprawling mansion they thought they had just secured entirely for free. Ebony and her racist freeloading husband Gavin were probably actively moving their cheap belongings into my expensive guest wing, assuming they had just permanently secured a lifetime of rent-free luxury living. Brenda was likely currently bragging to her entire church congregation about how her brilliant elite son had successfully outsmarted his aggressive working-class ex-wife and secured their prominent family legacy forever. They were all dancing, celebrating, and blindly drinking expensive vintage champagne inside a rapidly burning building. They were entirely oblivious to the terrifying fact that the invisible ticking time bomb firmly attached to their physical property deeds had already reached its final silent countdown. Donovan closed the heavy black binder with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed loudly through the quiet private lounge. He looked across the polished mahogany table at me, his dark eyes reflecting a deep, profound respect for the absolute cold-blooded ruthlessness of my corporate strategy. He asked me if I was entirely prepared to watch my former family burn their own comfortable lives to the absolute barren ground. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or lingering remorse for the terrible people who had treated me like a disposable financial machine for years. I smiled a cold, chilling, empty smile and told Donovan that I was not just prepared to watch them burn entirely. I told him I was actively, eagerly looking forward to warming my hands by the spectacular, devastating fire they had so enthusiastically built for themselves. I leaned back against the curved leather booth, running my fingers over the smooth surface of the table. I explained to Donovan how perfectly DeAndre's extreme arrogance had played right into our awaiting hands. When he threw those divorce papers onto the glass coffee table, demanding total, absolute control of Apex Holdings, LLC, he genuinely believed he was enacting the ultimate triumphant power play. He thought his demands were a brutal punishment for my supposed masculine energy and my unyielding career focus. He thought he was completely stripping me of my wealth to build a new perfect life with a young, naive Pilates instructor who would cater to his every fragile whim. He could not see that his demand for sole ownership was the exact specific trigger required to execute his own absolute financial ruin. He had blindly placed his own head directly on the chopping block and proudly handed me the heavy rope to release the falling blade. Donovan chuckled softly, a dark, rich sound that resonated in the quiet room. He noted that in all his long years of forensic accounting and aggressive corporate asset recovery, he had never witnessed a mark so willingly and enthusiastically sign their own financial death warrant. I picked up my glass of water and raised it slightly in a silent toast to the impending absolute destruction of the men and women who had severely underestimated the quiet, lethal power of a woman who built her own empire from nothing. The private meeting concluded with Donovan confirming that his aggressive legal team and his elite asset recovery agents were fully briefed and entirely on standby. They were just waiting for the final digital transmission of the signed court decree from the upcoming legal hearing. The moment the judge stamped the divorce settlement, making DeAndre the sole legal owner of the holding company, Donovan's automated banking systems would instantly flag the massive account for catastrophic default. The legal notices of immediate foreclosure and aggressive asset seizure were already drafted, printed, and waiting in pristine manila envelopes, ready to be hand-delivered to the mansion and to Brenda's suburban home. I thanked Donovan for his flawless execution of the financial strategy and stood up to leave the private members club. I walked back out into the cool evening air of the city, feeling lighter and more profoundly powerful than I had in years. The chaotic, toxic noise of my failed marriage and the relentless, suffocating disrespect of my in-laws were finally coming to an abrupt, violent, and highly calculated end. They had aggressively demanded absolutely everything I had ever worked for, and I had calmly, peacefully given it all to them, wrapped beautifully in $5.5 million of inescapable toxic debt. The financial guillotine was primed and ready to drop the exact moment DeAndre proudly walked into that courtroom. Fast forward to the present week, exactly 7 days before the final divorce hearing was scheduled to take place in the downtown Atlanta courthouse. The sprawling $4 million mansion that I had meticulously designed and paid for entirely with my corporate bonuses was currently vibrating with the obnoxious sounds of an unearned celebration. DeAndre had completely convinced himself that he had executed the ultimate power play of the century. He genuinely believed that my quiet departure and my willingness to sign the preliminary divorce papers was a sign of total, absolute submission. He thought he had finally broken my spirit and conquered my financial empire to celebrate his fake victorious milestone. He decided to throw a lavish, highly extravagant 7-day celebration right inside the walls of my former home. He invited all of his arrogant, underachieving fraternity brothers, his fake high society friends and local elites who were merely eager to drink free, expensive liquor. He paraded around the sprawling estate, wearing custom silk shirts, acting exactly like a visionary real estate mogul who had finally secured his rightful throne. The massive stone driveway was packed with leased luxury vehicles, and the backyard pool area was constantly filled with loud pulsing music and the clinking of crystal glasses. He was living out his ultimate billionaire fantasy, completely funded by the dangerous illusion of the settlement papers sitting on the glass coffee table. He stood at the head of the long dining table, giving arrogant speeches to his friends about how he had successfully tamed a difficult woman and secured his generational wealth. He proudly announced that his company Apex Holdings, LLC, was preparing to dominate the commercial real estate market, completely unaware that his beloved company was merely a hollow shell hiding a catastrophic financial bomb. Monique, the 26-year-old Pilates instructor, was aggressively playing the role of the new lady of the house. She strutted through the imported marble hallways, wearing the custom silk robes she had stolen from my closet. She spent her days ordering expensive luxury goods online, using whatever new lines of credit she could manipulate DeAndre into opening for her. She genuinely believed she had secured a lifetime of effortless wealth simply by catering to the fragile ego of an incompetent man. She rearranged my imported furniture, threw out my curated art pieces, and hosted lavish catered lunches by the pool. For her superficial friends, she posted endless photos and videos on her social media accounts, bragging about her new elite lifestyle. She made sure to tag the exact location of the multi-million-dollar estate in every single post, desperate to prove to her followers that she had successfully married into extreme generational wealth. She posed in front of the grand staircase acting like a wealthy socialite, completely oblivious to the fact that she was enthusiastically decorating the interior of a rapidly sinking ship. The parasitic invasion of my former sanctuary did not stop with the new mistress Brenda, the toxic, arrogant matriarch who had aggressively thrown my devastating medical diagnosis in my face, saw my quiet departure as the ultimate opportunity to elevate her own fake social standing. She eagerly invited her entire church committee and all the wealthy older women from her high society circles over to the mansion for an opulent catered brunch. She wanted to physically show off the massive estate, as if it were the crown jewel of her own family legacy. She walked the elite church ladies through the grand dining room and the custom-built chef's kitchen, bragging loudly about how her brilliant son had successfully outsmarted his overbearing, aggressively masculine ex-wife. Brenda completely twisted the narrative, painting me as a bitter, sterile corporate machine who was rightfully evicted, so her son could finally build a proper traditional family with a highly fertile, submissive woman. The church ladies sipped their expensive mimosas and nodded in sympathetic agreement, praising Brenda for raising such a strong, independent son. They admired the vaulted ceilings and the intricate architecture, entirely blind to the tragic irony of the situation Brenda was walking around, acting like the queen of the castle, boasting about her son's massive real estate portfolio, completely unaware that the very roof over her head was legally bound to a catastrophic commercial debt. She had no idea that her son's fake success was going to leave her entirely homeless in a matter of days. The luxury guest wing of the sprawling estate had been aggressively and permanently claimed by Ebony and her freeloading husband Gavin, the exact moment they realized I was not fighting the divorce settlement. They immediately packed up all their cheap belongings from their cramped downtown apartment. They completely broke their residential lease and moved directly into my custom-designed luxury guest suites, assuming they had just secured a permanent rent-free existence. Gavin, the underperforming day trader who had openly mocked my hustle culture energy, was now spending his entire days lounging lazily by my pristine swimming pool. He set up his multiple trading monitors on the expensive patio furniture, pretending to execute high-stakes stock market trades while actively drinking the remainder of my rare vintage bourbon collection. Gavin invited his own prejudiced friends over to the house, bragging about how he had finally moved into a proper elite neighborhood. He sat around smoking expensive cigars and taking full credit for the luxurious aesthetic of the home, making subtle racist jokes about how the house finally had some refined taste. Now that the angry corporate woman was gone, Ebony treated the mansion exactly like a five-star luxury hotel, ordering expensive food deliveries for every single meal and treating the exterior landscaping staff like her own personal servants. They were absolutely intoxicated by the unearned luxury, completely convinced that their proximity to DeAndre's fake success guaranteed them a lifetime of effortless comfort. They left their dirty dishes everywhere, blasted the television at all hours, and lived like absolute royalty on borrowed time. The sheer magnitude of their collective financial incompetence was truly staggering to witness from afar. My forensic accountant Donovan had set up discreet monitoring on the public financial filings related to the property and the corporate entity. The daily reports we received in our secure downtown office were absolutely hilarious to read. DeAndre was so desperately eager to maintain the illusion of unlimited wealth for his new fiancée and his arrogant family that he began making catastrophically reckless financial decisions because he firmly believed Apex Holdings, LLC, owned the $4 million mansion, free and clear. He started aggressively applying for massive high-interest personal loans and secondary commercial lines of credit. He used the artificially inflated value of the house as direct collateral to secure fast cash from predatory lenders who did not conduct thorough due diligence. He took out hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-interest debt just to fund the week-long celebration to buy Monique a massive diamond engagement ring to replace the one I had rightfully taken back, and to purchase a brand new luxury sports car to replace the one I had ruthlessly repossessed. He was signing aggressive loan documents left and right, completely oblivious to the terrifying fact that the primary property deed was already hopelessly encumbered by the $5.5 million mezzanine loan I had trapped him with. Every single dollar he borrowed was just another heavy concrete block chained tightly to his ankles, pulling him deeper into an inescapable financial abyss. He thought he was leveraging his assets like a true real estate titan, but he was actually just digging his own grave with a solid gold shovel. They were all spending wildly, swiping new credit cards, planning lavish future vacations, and living in a state of pure, unadulterated delusion. Monique was busy booking expensive wedding venues and placing deposits on designer bridal gowns, using the cash DeAndre had just borrowed against my former home. Brenda was promising massive financial donations to her church building fund, assuring the pastor that her son's wealthy real estate firm would happily cover the costs of the new community center. Ebony and Gavin were shopping for expensive new furniture to permanently decorate their stolen guest wing, entirely on credit. They thought the absolute worst part of their journey was finally over. They thought they had successfully defeated the cold, calculating black woman who had held them strictly accountable for years. They felt entirely victorious, untouched, and supremely powerful. They were completely unaware of the invisible ticking time bomb that was firmly attached to the property, deed resting silently inside the holding company portfolio. The massive commercial debt was hovering directly over their heads, like a sharp, heavy blade, waiting for the final mechanism to release it. The acceleration clause was sitting quietly in the dark, printed clearly on page 42 of the commercial loan agreement, just waiting for the final stroke of a judge's pen. The more they celebrated, the more they spent, the more they laughed at my supposed defeat, the sweeter the impending destruction became. I sat in my sleek glass-walled office in the city, sipping my coffee and reviewing the final legal strategies with Donovan. We watched the financial monitoring alerts roll in, tracking every single foolish dollar DeAndre borrowed against the doomed estate. The trap was perfectly set. The bait had been entirely swallowed, and the absolute total annihilation of their fake elite reality was scheduled to detonate in exactly 7 days. The sheer arrogance of their premature celebration was a profound testament to their fundamental lack of basic financial literacy. Anyone with even a minor understanding of corporate law or commercial real estate would have immediately initiated a comprehensive title search before assuming total ownership of a multi-million-dollar holding company. A simple background check would have instantly revealed the massive institutional lien filed against the property. But DeAndre was too blinded by his own narcissistic reflection to ever question the authenticity of his sudden windfall. He genuinely believed that his innate superiority and his masculine dominance had simply overwhelmed my legal defenses. He thought I had surrendered the company because I was too heartbroken and too emotionally devastated by his rejection to fight him in court. He spent the final days of the week hosting a massive catered barbecue in the backyard, importing expensive Wagyu beef and hiring private chefs to cook for his freeloading friends. The music blared late into the night, disturbing the wealthy elite neighbors. They so desperately wanted to impress. The Neighborhood Homeowners Association began filing noise complaints and issuing hefty fines, but DeAndre simply laughed them off. He told the security patrol that he was a powerful corporate CEO and that he could easily afford to pay whatever petty fines they wanted to issue. He was burning through his predatory loans at an astonishing, terrifying rate, treating the borrowed cash like an infinite fountain of personal wealth. Brenda stood on the expansive marble patio, holding a crystal glass of sweet tea, looking out over the manicured lawn with a look of supreme, arrogant satisfaction. She loudly told the gathered crowd that God had finally blessed her faithful family and removed the dark, negative energy from their lives. She claimed that my departure was a divine intervention designed to elevate her son to his rightful place among the city's most elite wealthy families. They raised their glasses and toasted to my permanent absence, to my supposed financial ruin, and to their bright, limitless future. They clinked their expensive champagne flutes together, their loud, obnoxious laughter echoing into the warm night air. They were entirely consumed by their collective delusion, feeding off each other's fake prestige and celebrating a victory that was mathematically entirely impossible. The magnificent golden cage I had built for them was incredibly comfortable, but the heavy steel doors had already locked firmly shut, and the air supply was rapidly running out. The warm Atlanta breeze carried the heavy scent of expensive catered barbecue and the loud, thumping bass of a hired DJ across the sprawling manicured lawns of the $4 million estate. It was the 7th and final night of DeAndre's unearned victory lap. The premature celebration had reached its absolute peak of delusional arrogance. The backyard pool area was illuminated by floating LED lights and modern tiki torches, casting a warm golden glow over the crowd of freeloading guests who were busy draining the last bottles of my vintage wine collection. They were completely intoxicated by the illusion of unlimited wealth, dancing on the pristine stone patio and laughing obnoxiously into the night air. They had absolutely no idea that the true owner of the property was currently standing just outside the wrought iron side gate, waiting patiently in the shadows, with the man who held the detonator to their entire fake reality. Donovan and I had arrived in his sleek black Bentley, parking discreetly down the street to avoid alerting the private security patrol that DeAndre had foolishly hired using predatory loans. I still possessed the master override codes for the estate security system. I simply typed the numeric sequence into the hidden keypad, and the heavy iron gate clicked open with a soft mechanical sigh. We walked down the stone pathway that led directly to the resort-style pool deck, moving with the quiet, lethal synchronization of two apex predators, stepping into a cage full of oblivious mice. I was wearing a sharp, perfectly tailored charcoal business suit that signaled absolute corporate authority, while Donovan walked beside me in a dark, bespoke suit, radiating an impenetrable aura of ruthless physical and financial power. We did not announce our arrival. We simply stepped out from the shadows of the tall, manicured hedges and walked directly onto the crowded pool deck. The visual impact of our sudden intrusion was like a bucket of ice water being thrown over the sweaty, chaotic party. A few of the wealthy neighbors, who had shown up just for the free liquor, noticed us first. Their loud conversations abruptly halted, and they instinctively stepped backward, creating a wide clearing on the stone patio. The DJ, who was stationed near the outdoor kitchen, caught sight of Donovan's imposing figure and completely panicked. His hand slipped on the mixing board, and the loud pulsing music was instantly, violently cut off. The sudden heavy silence that fell over the backyard was deafening. The only sounds left were the gentle sloshing of the swimming pool and the soft hum of the outdoor refrigerators. DeAndre was standing at the edge of the shallow end, surrounded by his underachieving fraternity brothers holding a crystal glass of my expensive bourbon. He turned around slowly, annoyed by the sudden interruption of his favorite song. When his eyes locked onto mine, the initial flash of genuine terror was instantly replaced by a massive, overcompensating wave of sheer narcissistic arrogance. He genuinely believed that my presence at his party was the ultimate validation of his fake superiority. He looked at my tailored business suit and assumed that I had finally cracked under the pressure of losing my multi-million-dollar empire. His drunken mind computed my arrival as an act of absolute desperation. He smiled a wide, vicious smirk, showing all of his teeth as he confidently strutted toward the center of the patio, leaving his friends behind to watch the spectacle. He opened his arms wide in a mock welcoming gesture, speaking loudly enough for every single guest in the backyard to hear him clearly. He asked me if the tiny, cramped apartment I was supposedly renting had finally gotten too depressing for my aggressive masculine energy. He laughed a harsh, cruel sound that echoed off the surface of the pool. He told his friends that the angry corporate machine had finally returned to beg for her house back. He stated that he knew I would not last a single week without the luxurious comforts that his new company, Apex Holdings, LLC, was now providing for his family. Monique, the Pilates instructor, stepped up right beside him, wrapping her arms possessively around his waist. She looked at me with a pathetic, smug expression, giggling softly, as DeAndre publicly humiliated the woman who had fully funded his entire adult life. Brenda pushed her way through the crowd of church friends, her face flushed with cheap wine and unearned vindication. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me and loudly declared that the Lord always humbles the proud and the wicked. She told the crowd that I had come crawling back to ask for financial mercy because my sterile, cold heart could not handle the reality of seeing her son build a proper traditional family with a highly fertile woman. They were all feeding off each other's toxic delusions, building a massive, towering monument of lies right in front of my face. They desperately wanted me to fall to my knees and negotiate a lesser settlement to cry and plead for a fraction of the assets I had built from nothing. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with DeAndre, and I did not offer a single word of defense against their pathetic, unhinged rants. I simply stood there in the warm night air completely unbothered, allowing their foolish arrogance to echo into the silence. My absolute lack of an emotional response began to make the crowd incredibly uncomfortable. The fraternity brothers stopped laughing. The church ladies shifted nervously on their feet. The reality that I was not acting like a defeated, broken woman was slowly beginning to pierce through their drunken haze. Gavin, the freeloading day trader who had permanently moved into my guest wing, decided that this was his ultimate moment to prove his masculine worth to his new wealthy in-laws. He was heavily intoxicated, his face pale and sweating, his dress shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest. He stumbled forward, pushing past DeAndre and Monique to position himself directly in front of Donovan. Gavin had always harbored deep-seated racial and classist prejudices, masking them behind passive-aggressive comments and subtle microaggressions. But fueled by the expensive liquor and the illusion of his new elite status, the toxic filter completely dissolved. Gavin puffed out his chest, attempting to use his height to physically intimidate my forensic accountant. He slurred his words, pointing a shaking finger directly at Donovan's expensive suit. He used heavily coded prejudiced language, telling Donovan that aggressive, threatening people like him did not belong in this exclusive zip code. He told Donovan that he needed to take his angry client and walk back out the gate before the real homeowners called the police to have them dragged away like common street trash. Gavin leaned in closer, his breath reeking of my stolen vintage liquor, attempting to assert a fake biological and social dominance over a man who literally held the power to vaporize his entire existence. Donovan did not argue with the drunken parasite. He did not raise his voice to engage in a pathetic shouting match, and he certainly did not take a single step backward. Donovan operated in the high-stakes world of shadow private equity, where brutal physical and financial conflicts were resolved with surgical, terrifying efficiency. He looked at Gavin with the profound, chilling indifference of a man stepping on a loud, annoying cockroach. With one swift, incredibly calculated and effortless movement, Donovan stepped directly into Gavin's personal space. He placed his large hands firmly against Gavin's chest and shoved him backward with a massive burst of kinetic energy. The sheer force of the push lifted Gavin completely off his feet. He flailed wildly in the air, his arms wheeling in a desperate, pathetic attempt to grab onto something solid. He found nothing but empty space. Gavin flew backward over the edge of the stone patio and crashed violently directly into the deep end of the illuminated swimming pool. The impact created a massive, explosive splash that sent gallons of cold, chlorinated water soaking over the expensive shoes and designer dresses of the wealthy guests standing nearby. The water closed over Gavin's head, completely submerging the arrogant day trader in the very luxury pool he had claimed as his own. Ebony let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream that shattered the remaining silence in the backyard. She dropped her designer handbag and ran to the edge of the pool, screaming her husband's name as Gavin frantically thrashed his way to the surface, gasping and choking on the water. The entire party erupted into absolute chaotic panic. The fraternity brothers took a collective, terrified step backward, away from Donovan, realizing instantly that they were entirely out of their depth. Brenda clutched her chest, gasping in horror at the sudden display of raw, unadulterated physical power. The polite illusion of their high society gathering was completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. I completely ignored the screaming woman and the thrashing man in the pool. My focus remained entirely locked on DeAndre, who was now staring at Donovan with wide, terrified eyes, his bravado completely washed away by the sudden, violent escalation. I calmly stepped forward, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a corporate executioner. I walked directly over to the expensive glass patio table sitting between us. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. The envelope was securely sealed with red tamper-evident tape and stamped with the official insignia of Donovan's private equity firm. I placed the heavy envelope gently onto the glass table. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. I did not raise my voice, but the cold, lethal clarity of my tone cut perfectly through the sounds of Gavin's choking and Ebony's hysterical crying. I looked DeAndre dead in the eye, stripping away the final remnants of his fake billionaire persona. I told him to enjoy every single second of this lavish party, and to soak in the luxurious atmosphere of the mansion while he still could. I reminded him in a voice as smooth as glass that our final divorce hearing was scheduled for exactly 9 in the morning at the downtown courthouse. I told him not to be late because the judge was incredibly eager to finalize his absolute total ownership of the holding company. DeAndre was completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in the power dynamic, but his massive, fragile ego could not handle the public humiliation of being spoken down to in front of his friends and his mistress. He desperately needed to reclaim the narrative and prove that he was still the untouchable alpha male in the yard. He looked at the thick manila envelope sitting on the table, assuming it contained pathetic legal pleas or desperate financial settlement offers from my attorney. He scoffed loudly, a forced, nervous sound, trying to project a confidence he no longer felt. He reached out and grabbed the sealed envelope from the glass table. He looked around at his guests, attempting to muster a triumphant smirk. He loudly declared that he was absolutely done negotiating with a bitter, angry woman who could not accept defeat. He stated that he would not waste a single second of his victory party reading empty, pathetic threats from a failed corporate executive. With a dramatic, sweeping gesture, DeAndre turned and tossed the heavy, unopened manila envelope directly into the swimming pool, right next to where Gavin was currently clinging to the stone edge, shivering and coughing up chlorinated water. The thick paper envelope hit the surface of the pool and immediately began to sink. The highly sensitive financial foreclosure warnings and the catastrophic default notices slowly absorbing the water and drifting down toward the illuminated bottom of the deep end. DeAndre turned back to me, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for me to scream or react with anger at his profound disrespect. He wanted to see me break. He wanted to see the devastation of my supposed final plea being carelessly thrown into the garbage. I did not give him anything. I simply looked at the sinking envelope and then back up at his smug, terrified face. I allowed a slow, genuine smile to spread across my lips. It was a smile of pure, untouchable peace and absolute devastating finality. He had just willingly thrown away the only advanced warning he would ever receive regarding the $5.5 million financial bomb that was strapped directly to his chest. The execution was now entirely unavoidable. I did not say another word. I turned gracefully on my heel, my tailored suit jacket catching the warm night breeze. Donovan fell perfectly into step beside me, his dark eyes scanning the terrified crowd one last time before turning away. We walked calmly and steadily back toward the wrought iron side gate, leaving the chaotic, screaming, frantic mess of a party completely behind us. The heavy metal gate clicked firmly shut, securing the trap perfectly in place. We walked back to the waiting Bentley, the sound of our footsteps echoing softly on the quiet suburban street. The final night of their glorious, unearned celebration was officially over. The morning sun would bring the courthouse the judge and the absolute spectacular incineration of their entire fraudulent existence. The morning sun broke over the downtown Atlanta skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete steps of the Fulton County Courthouse. I stepped out of Donovan's black Bentley, feeling the crisp morning air against my face. Today was the day of the final divorce hearing. Today was the day the magnificent financial guillotine I had spent 18 months meticulously constructing would finally be released. I wore a simple, perfectly tailored charcoal business suit. It was completely devoid of flashy labels or ostentatious accessories. It was the uniform of a woman who operated in the highest echelons of corporate strategy. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, tight bun, and my expression was a mask of absolute, impenetrable calm. Donovan walked silently beside me, carrying a slim leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of the man I used to call my husband. We walked through the heavy metal detectors and navigated the echoing marble hallways of the judicial building. The atmosphere inside the courthouse was sterile and oppressive, but to me it felt like a grand theater waiting for the final act of a masterpiece. We arrived at the designated courtroom and took our seats quietly at the petitioner's table. My legal counsel, a brilliant and highly aggressive divorce attorney named Marcus, was already sitting there organizing the final separation documents. He looked at me and offered a brief, respectful nod. completely aware of the massive financial bomb that was currently ticking away inside the paperwork. 15 minutes later, the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with an obnoxious, disruptive amount of force. DeAndre strutted into the quiet judicial chamber, acting exactly like a billionaire real estate mogul arriving at a red carpet premiere. He was wearing a custom-tailored three-piece suit in a loud, obnoxious shade of royal blue. The fabric was far too shiny for a Tuesday morning court hearing, and the tailoring was aggressively tight, clearly designed to show off his physique rather than project professional competence. He wore a massive diamond-encrusted watch on his left wrist, a piece of jewelry that he had undoubtedly purchased using the predatory high-interest loans he had recklessly taken out against my former mansion just a few days ago. He walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with a swaggering, arrogant bounce in his step, completely intoxicated by his own delusional superiority. Clinging tightly to his right arm was Monique, the 26-year-old Pilates instructor who genuinely believed she had just secured a lifetime of effortless generational wealth. She was wearing a skin-tight designer dress that was entirely inappropriate for a formal legal setting, holding a luxury handbag that I had indirectly paid for. Walking right behind them was Brenda, the toxic, arrogant matriarch of the family. She was dressed in an extravagant, wide-brimmed church hat and a deeply pretentious matching suit, walking into the courtroom as if she were the Queen Mother arriving to witness the royal coronation of her precious son. They moved into the gallery seating area, making as much noise as humanly possible. Brenda and Monique sat down in the wooden pews right behind the respondents' table, deliberately positioning themselves where I could easily hear every single vicious word they spoke. They immediately began whispering loudly and maliciously, exchanging nasty comments about my simple tailored business suit. Brenda leaned over to Monique and scoffed, stating that I looked like a depressed, sterile bank teller who had completely given up on her femininity. She loudly whispered that it was no wonder her successful, handsome son had to look elsewhere for a real woman, because my aggressive masculine energy and my boring clothes were deeply offensive to a man of his high society stature. Monique giggled aggressively, covering her mouth with her manicured hand, and whispered back that I looked absolutely pathetic sitting there in my plain gray suit waiting to be completely stripped of my wealth. I did not turn around. I did not flinch or offer them a single glance of acknowledgement. I sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead at the empty judge's bench, allowing their pathetic, shallow insults to wash completely over me. They were judging my clothing and my appearance, entirely oblivious to the fact that the simple charcoal suit I was wearing cost more than Monique's entire annual salary at the fitness studio. They were utterly obsessed with the superficial illusion of wealth, while I was sitting quietly with the absolute power to legally vaporize their entire existence. DeAndre took his seat at the table next to his highly aggressive, boisterous defense attorney. He leaned back in the heavy wooden chair, crossing his legs and shooting me a wide, smug, victorious smirk. He genuinely believed that my silence was a sign of total defeat. He thought I was sitting there paralyzed by the heartbreak of losing my mansion and my business empire to his undeniable masculine dominance. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened, and the bailiff instructed the courtroom to rise. The judge, a stern older man with sharp, tired eyes and a completely no-nonsense demeanor, walked in and took his seat. He adjusted his glasses, pulled the thick stack of final settlement documents toward him, and sighed heavily. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from a loud, arrogant spectacle to a rigid, formal legal proceeding. The judge looked out over the courtroom, his gaze lingering for a brief moment on DeAndre's overly flashy suit and the disruptive whispering coming from Brenda in the gallery. He picked up his pen and formally called the docket number, initiating the final phase of our legal dissolution. DeAndre's lawyer immediately stood up from his chair. He was a loud, performative man who perfectly matched his client's fake, aggressive energy. He practically shouted his opening statements to the judge, determined to make a grand theatrical show of my supposed financial surrender. The lawyer aggressively pushed to ensure the absolute permanent separation of all marital assets. He spoke rapidly, pointing his finger at the paperwork as he explicitly reiterated the primary terms of the settlement. He loudly declared for the public court record that his client Meister DeAndre was assuming total and absolute sole ownership of the $4 million primary residence. He made sure to heavily emphasize that I was entirely forfeiting any and all future claims to the property, relinquishing my rights to the estate forever. The arrogant lawyer did not stop there. He puffed out his chest and moved to the crown jewel of the settlement agreement. He explicitly directed the judge's attention to the corporate transfer documents regarding the investment firm. He aggressively reiterated that my client Justine was voluntarily surrendering 100% of the executive control and total legal ownership of Apex Holdings LLC directly to his client. The lawyer spoke with extreme condescension, framing the transfer not as a mutual agreement, but as a massive victorious conquest by DeAndre. He wanted it permanently recorded in the judicial transcripts that the visionary real estate mogul DeAndre was taking his rightful company back, and that I, the bitter ex-wife, was walking away with absolutely nothing. DeAndre sat at his table nodding enthusiastically, along with every single arrogant word his lawyer spoke. He kept turning his head to look back at Monique and Brenda in the gallery, flashing them bright, triumphant smiles as his legal counsel systematically listed off the massive multi-million-dollar assets he was supposedly acquiring for free. Brenda was practically vibrating in her wooden pew, murmuring loud praises to the Lord for delivering all of this magnificent wealth directly into her son's capable hands. They were entirely consumed by their collective greed, celebrating a monumental financial victory that was mathematically and legally impossible. I sat perfectly still beside my own attorney. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table in front of me, my face entirely devoid of emotion. I did not object to the aggressive framing by DeAndre's lawyer. I did not ask my counsel to intervene or soften the blow of the absolute asset forfeiture. I wanted DeAndre to claim complete and total ownership of the company loudly, proudly, and on the permanent legal record. I needed him to legally bind himself to the corporate entity in front of a sitting judge without a single shred of ambiguity. The trap required his willing, enthusiastic consent, and he was eagerly sprinting toward the bait with his mouth wide open. The judge listened to the loud, aggressive posturing of DeAndre's lawyer with a look of mild irritation. He had presided over thousands of divorce hearings, and he clearly possessed a deep distaste for flashy, performative attorneys and arrogant respondents. The judge held up his hand, stopping the lawyer mid-sentence. He looked down at the thick stack of financial disclosures, the corporate transfer deeds, and the final settlement agreements. He flipped slowly through the pages, his sharp eyes scanning the dense legal text. The courtroom fell into a tense, heavy silence as the only sound in the massive room was the soft rustling of paper turning under the judge's fingers. The judge paused. His hand stopped moving over the documents, and his eyes narrowed slightly as he focused on a very specific, highly detailed section of the corporate transfer agreement. He read the clause silently to himself, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the absolute legal ramifications of the text. He slowly lowered the paperwork and looked directly over his glasses at DeAndre. The stern older man leaned forward, resting his forearms on the heavy wooden bench. The atmosphere in the room suddenly grew incredibly dense and oppressive. The arrogant smirks on the faces of the defense team began to falter slightly under the intense, unwavering scrutiny of the presiding magistrate. The judge addressed DeAndre directly, his voice calm, steady, and carrying the immense crushing weight of absolute legal authority. He asked DeAndre to stand up and answer a very specific clarifying question for the official court record. DeAndre immediately stood up from his chair, adjusting his shiny royal blue suit jacket with a confident swagger. He looked at the judge with the unearned arrogance of a man who believed he was the smartest person in the entire building. He was entirely ready to accept his crown and claim his multi-million-dollar empire. The judge looked DeAndre dead in the eye and asked him if he fully comprehended the legal magnitude of the documents he was about to finalize. The judge specifically highlighted the transfer of the corporate entity. He asked DeAndre if he was absolutely certain beyond any shadow of a doubt that he wanted to assume total singular control of the holding company known as Apex Holdings LLC. The judge paused for a fraction of a second, ensuring the entire room was listening closely. He then added the most critical, devastating phrase of the entire hearing. He asked DeAndre if he was fully prepared to accept total singular control of the holding company and all of its associated liabilities. The word liabilities hung in the cold air of the courtroom, echoing softly against the marble walls. It was a massive, terrifying legal term that carried the power to completely destroy a person's entire financial existence. But DeAndre fundamentally lacked the basic financial literacy to understand the lethal danger of that specific word. In his arrogant, delusional mind, he assumed the word liabilities simply meant covering the basic utility bills for the mansion, paying the monthly landscaping crew, and maybe covering a few minor corporate taxes for his new real estate firm. He thought it was just standard legal jargon meant to bore him. He had absolutely no idea that the specific liabilities attached to Apex Holdings LLC included a catastrophic $5.5 million commercial mezzanine loan that was currently hovering directly over his head. DeAndre did not hesitate. He did not turn to consult with his loud, aggressive lawyer to ask for a detailed explanation of the corporate liabilities. He did not pause to consider why his notoriously ruthless corporate executive ex-wife was so incredibly willing to hand him a $4 million estate and a holding company completely free of charge. His massive, fragile ego and his desperate, pathetic need to show off in front of his new young mistress and his toxic mother completely blinded him to the reality of the situation. He puffed out his chest, standing incredibly tall in his custom suit. He looked back at the gallery, offering a wide, victorious smile to Monique and Brenda, who were beaming with unearned pride. He then turned back to face the stern older judge. DeAndre spoke loudly and confidently, ensuring his voice echoed perfectly for the public court record. He stated proudly that yes, he was absolutely certain he wanted total singular control of the company, and he was more than ready to assume all of its associated liabilities. He claimed he was a visionary businessman, and he was fully prepared to take his new real estate empire to the absolute top of the market. He stood there basking in his own fake glory, completely unaware that he had just enthusiastically pulled the pin on a massive financial grenade and swallowed it whole. The stern older judge did not immediately respond to DeAndre's enthusiastic, loud declaration of assuming all corporate liabilities. Instead, the judge slowly reached up with a weathered hand and adjusted the thick glasses resting on the bridge of his nose. He flipped over the primary settlement agreement and turned to the dense, deeply buried financial disclosure addendums attached to the back of the corporate transfer deed. The courtroom remained suspended in a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound echoing in the massive chamber was the crisp, sharp rustling of the thick legal paper being turned page by page. I watched the exact, precise moment the judge's eyes widened slightly behind his lenses. His rigorous judicial composure fractured for a fraction of a second as his gaze locked onto the staggering, catastrophic numbers, printed clearly in black ink. He lowered the document slowly, his expression shifting from mild irritation with a flashy respondent to profound, absolute disbelief. The judge looked back down at DeAndre, who was still standing at the defense table puffing his chest out like a victorious conqueror. The judge let out a long, heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades of courtroom tragedies. He looked at DeAndre's loud, aggressive lawyer, and then back to DeAndre himself. The atmosphere in the room suddenly grew incredibly dense and oppressive. The judge addressed the courtroom in a dry, bewildered tone, asking why the defense team was so incredibly eager to assume total ownership of a corporate holding company that had just officially defaulted on a $5.5 million commercial loan exactly 2 hours ago. The massive astronomical number hung suspended in the cold air of the courtroom like a physical weight. $5.5 million. DeAndre blinked rapidly, his arrogant smile freezing on his face and slowly morphing into a look of profound, stupid confusion. He looked at the judge as if the older man had just started speaking in a completely foreign language. DeAndre actually let out a short, nervous chuckle, genuinely believing that the stern magistrate had somehow misread the complicated paperwork or made a bizarre arithmetic error. He confidently told the judge that there must be some sort of massive clerical mistake because his highly successful real estate firm, Apex Holdings LLC, owned a $4 million mansion entirely free and clear, and certainly did not carry any multi-million-dollar commercial debt. He stood there still trying to maintain his fake billionaire persona, completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath his feet had just entirely given way. DeAndre's loud performative defense lawyer did not laugh. Lawyers possess a specific terrifying instinct for recognizing when a fatal legal trap has just snapped shut around their client's neck. The lawyer aggressively snatched the thick stack of financial disclosures directly from the table, his hands trembling violently as he flipped frantically to the page the judge had just referenced. The color instantly and violently drained from the lawyer's face, leaving his skin looking like wet gray ash. His eyes darted rapidly back and forth across the dense legal text, reading the heavily coded financial jargon that he had completely failed to properly review during his hasty, arrogant preparation for this final hearing. His mouth dropped open in absolute, unadulterated horror as he finally digested the lethal mechanics of the mezzanine loan I had planted 12 months prior. He realized in that exact, terrifying moment that his own professional negligence had just aided in the absolute financial slaughter of his client. The lawyer began to read the specific acceleration clause out loud to the silent courtroom, his voice shaking with pure professional terror. He read the exact, irrefutable legal phrasing stating that the massive commercial debt was directly and inextricably tied to the marital structure of the primary corporate stakeholders. He stumbled over the complex words as he announced to the court that by finalizing this exact divorce decree and demanding 100% total control of the corporate asset, his client, Mr. DeAndre, had officially and legally triggered the immediate automatic repayment of the entire $5.5 million debt. The lawyer dropped the heavy stack of papers onto the table as if they were physically burning his bare hands. He looked at his client with an expression of profound pity and absolute dread, explaining that the debt was no longer a long-term corporate liability, but an immediate, catastrophic personal obligation that had completely matured the exact second DeAndre proudly claimed the company as his own. DeAndre physically staggered backward, bracing his shaking hands against the heavy wooden defense table to keep his weak legs from collapsing underneath him. His custom-tailored royal blue suit suddenly looked like a ridiculous clown costume, wrapping a deeply terrified and incredibly small man. He stammered frantically, demanding to know what the judge and his lawyer were talking about. He began waving his arms wildly, arguing that he never signed any paperwork for a $5.5 million loan and that I must have secretly taken out the massive funding to illegally frame him. The pure panic in his voice was a sharp, devastating contrast to the swaggering arrogance he had displayed just 10 minutes ago. He looked back at the gallery, desperately searching for validation or rescue from his new young mistress Monique and his toxic mother Brenda. But they were both staring back at him with wide, horrified eyes, completely paralyzed by the astronomical, catastrophic numbers being casually thrown around the courtroom. The smug, victorious whispers from the gallery had entirely ceased, replaced by the suffocating silence of impending ruin. I did not show a single ounce of sympathy. I did not break my cold clinical composure or offer a single word of comfort to the man who had tried to discard me and steal my empire. I reached forward with slow, deliberate grace and picked up the small plastic water bottle resting on the petitioner's table. I calmly uncapped it and took a slow, refreshing sip of the cool water, allowing DeAndre to completely drown in his frantic, pathetic panic for a few agonizing, heavily silent seconds. I placed the bottle back onto the table and looked my ex-husband dead in the eye, completely stripping away the final lingering remnants of his fake billionaire persona. I spoke with a smooth, chilling elegance that carried effortlessly across the quiet courtroom, reaching the ears of every single person present. I reminded him of the private exclusive dinner we shared exactly 1 year ago when I so graciously gifted him the prestigious title of Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings, LLC. I reminded him of the massive stack of commercial paperwork he had eagerly and enthusiastically signed that night without ever bothering to consult an independent financial auditor or even read the microscopic fine print. I pointed out that his massive, fragile ego was completely blinded by his desperate, pathetic need to feel like a powerful real estate mogul among his underachieving fraternity brothers. I informed him that he had indeed personally signed the $5.5 million mezzanine loan using his hollow shell company as his shield and the $4 million mansion as his sword. I told him that he had spent the entire past 12 months burning through the massive institutional funding to finance his fake lifestyle, completely oblivious to the fact that he was actively digging his own massive financial grave. DeAndre shook his head violently, his eyes wide with profound denial and mounting terror. He yelled across the courtroom that this was impossible, that I was lying, and that the bank would never give someone like him that kind of money without my direct legal co-signature. I smiled a cold, empty smile and reminded him of the ruthless private equity manager named Donovan, the very same man he had arrogantly tried to intimidate by the swimming pool just a few nights ago. I explained that shadow equity firms do not operate like traditional local banks. They do not care about your credit score when they know they can legally seize and violently liquidate a multi-million-dollar piece of real estate the exact moment you inevitably default on the impossible terms. I reminded DeAndre of the thick sealed manila envelope I had gently placed on the patio table during his lavish unearned celebration. I told him that the envelope he so arrogantly and carelessly tossed into the deep end of the swimming pool contained the official legal notices of his catastrophic default. The private equity firm had officially formally demanded their money, and because he ignored the legal warning, he was now entirely out of time. I watched the absolute devastation crash down onto his sweating face as the crushing reality of his own profound stupidity finally set into his brain. He realized in that exact terrifying moment that I had not surrendered my wealth because I was a broken, defeated woman who could not handle his masculine energy. I had enthusiastically surrendered the company because it was a highly toxic radioactive asset that was about to explode, and I desperately needed a willing, naive target to absorb the massive financial blast. I looked at the man who had allowed his family to disrespect me in my own home, who had allowed his mistress to wear my custom clothing, and who had aggressively tried to strip me of everything I had ever worked for. I leaned slightly forward, resting my hands on the polished wood of the petitioner's table. I informed my ex-husband that since he had so aggressively and publicly demanded 100% ownership of the holding company in front of a sitting judge, he now legally and undeniably owned 100% of the catastrophic debt attached to its name. I told him that the shadow private equity firm managing his defaulted loan was not a friendly, forgiving institution that would grant him a single day of leniency or a convenient payment plan. They were apex predators, and they were currently circling the blood in the water that he had so willingly spilled. He wanted to take absolutely everything from me, and I had peacefully, calmly complied by handing him the heavy, absolute, crushing weight of his own profound, inescapable financial ruin. The stern older judge was not finished dismantling the pathetic remains of DeAndre's fake reality. He tapped his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, demanding absolute order in his courtroom as the frantic murmurs began to rise from the gallery. He adjusted his thick glasses once more and turned to the final pages of the densely packed financial addendums attached to the mezzanine loan. He informed the silent, terrified room that the catastrophic debt was not merely a passive obligation waiting to be addressed at a later date. Because the loan had immediately entered a state of catastrophic default, the exact second DeAndre proudly claimed the holding company, the private equity firm had already initiated the aggressive legal foreclosure process. The judge read the formal declaration stating that the $4 million primary residence, the massive, sprawling mansion that DeAndre and his mistress had spent the entire last week celebrating inside, was officially being seized by the lender's asset recovery division. DeAndre physically swayed his hands, gripping the edges of the defense table so tightly, his knuckles turned white as he realized he was not a billionaire real estate mogul, but a man who was about to be violently evicted from a house he never truly owned. But the absolute financial slaughter did not stop with the primary estate. The judge flipped to the final execution clause of the commercial contract. His sharp, tired eyes scanned the gallery section directly behind the defense table, searching the faces of the remaining audience members. He asked the courtroom in a dry, clinical tone if there was a Miss Brenda currently present in the judicial chamber. Brenda, the arrogant, toxic matriarch who had spent the entire morning whispering nasty, vicious insults about my tailored business suit, slowly stood up from her wooden pew. She looked deeply confused, her extravagant, wide-brimmed church hat suddenly looking utterly ridiculous in the sterile atmosphere of the legal setting. She proudly identified herself as DeAndre's mother, assuming the judge was about to offer her some sort of legal sympathy or perhaps ask her to formally witness her son's acquisition of his new empire. Instead, the judge looked at her with an expression of profound, heavy pity. The judge looked back down at the heavily coded financial paperwork and began to read the cross-collateralization clause out loud for the public court record. He explained the terrifying legal mechanics of the trap I had so brilliantly designed. He stated that in order to secure the massive $5.5 million institutional funding, the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings LLC had legally pledged a secondary piece of hard real estate to back the commercial venture. The judge read the exact address of the suburban property. It was Brenda's address. He informed the horrified older woman that her fully paid-off longtime primary residence had been explicitly listed as direct hard collateral on her son's incredibly toxic business loan. Because the primary corporate debt was now in a state of immediate, unresolvable default, the shadow private equity firm was actively and legally seizing her home as well. The judge stated with cold, absolute finality that the foreclosure notices had already been finalized and that she was officially losing her house to the bank. The psychological break of the arrogant high society matriarch was instantaneous and violently explosive. Brenda let out a raw, piercing, blood-curdling scream that shattered the heavy silence of the courtroom and echoed violently off the marble walls. It was the sound of a woman whose entire fake elite identity had just been completely incinerated in a matter of seconds. The horrific realization that her own precious golden son, the man she had blindly elevated and protected at the expense of my sanity, had secretly aggressively gambled away, her only true financial asset, crashed down onto her fragile mind. She was not going to be a wealthy, silent partner in a massive real estate empire. She was going to be completely and utterly homeless. Her prestigious standing among the wealthy church ladies, her arrogant boasting, and her deep-seated sense of unearned superiority evaporated into pure, unadulterated panic. Brenda completely lost any remaining shred of her fake, refined elegance. She lunged forward, pushing past the low wooden barrier that separated the gallery from the legal tables. She threw herself directly at DeAndre, her face contorted into a mask of pure hysterical fury. Before the heavy-set court bailiff could even react or step forward to physically restrain her, Brenda raised her hand and delivered a massive, violent slap directly across her own son's face. The sharp cracking sound of the physical impact echoed loudly through the entire judicial chamber. She began screaming at him at the top of her lungs, crying hysterically as she cursed him for his profound, absolute stupidity. She yelled that he had ruined her, that he had secretly stolen her home and left her with absolutely nothing. She beat her fists against his chest, demanding to know how he could be so incredibly foolish to sign away her property without understanding the catastrophic legal consequences. DeAndre did not even try to defend himself. He just stood there, absorbing the physical and verbal blows, completely paralyzed by the astronomical magnitude of his own monumental failure. While the toxic matriarch was actively assaulting her own son in the middle of a federal courtroom, Monique, the 26-year-old Pilates instructor, was standing perfectly still in the gallery. Her wide, terrified eyes were rapidly processing the devastating financial math that had just been clearly laid out by the presiding judge. She had eagerly, enthusiastically destroyed a marriage and paraded around my $4 million mansion because she genuinely believed she was securing a lifetime of effortless generational wealth. She had endured the stressful legal proceedings and the arrogant family dynamics solely because she thought the ultimate payoff was a billionaire lifestyle. But the harsh, blinding light of the courtroom had just ruthlessly exposed the pathetic truth. DeAndre was not a powerful visionary real estate mogul. He was an unemployed, severely incompetent man who was currently $5.5 million in debt, holding zero tangible assets and completely responsible for making his own mother homeless. Monique realized with absolute terrifying clarity that tying herself to DeAndre meant attaching herself to a sinking ship made entirely of massive, unpayable debt. She wanted a luxury lifestyle, not a lifetime of running from aggressive corporate debt collectors and private equity asset recovery teams. The deep, blinding greed that had fueled her entire affair was instantly, violently extinguished. She looked at DeAndre, who was currently weeping and cowering away from his hysterical mothers. Physical blows and her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. The man she thought was her golden ticket to high society was nothing more than a pathetic broke loser who had been entirely funded by the incredibly brilliant corporate executive sitting calmly across the room. Monique did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second to protect her own interests. She reached down and grabbed her left hand aggressively, twisting the large, shiny diamond engagement ring off her finger. It was the very same ring DeAndre had likely purchased using the heavily extended secondary credit lines that I had already permanently severed. She marched right up to the low wooden barrier, her skin-tight designer dress suddenly looking incredibly cheap and ridiculous amidst the catastrophic legal implosion. She threw the heavy diamond ring directly at DeAndre's chest with as much violent force as she could physically muster. The ring hit his shiny custom royal blue suit jacket and bounced off, landing with a sharp metallic clatter on the hardwood floor of the courtroom. Monique screamed at him, her voice dripping with absolute profound contempt. She called him a pathetic broke loser and a massive fake who had completely wasted her time. She yelled that she was not going to spend the rest of her youth living in a tiny, cramped apartment, hiding from aggressive bank auditors and paying off a massive $5 million commercial loan that he was too stupid to understand. She told him he deserved exactly what he was getting, and that he was absolutely nothing without the brilliant woman he had so arrogantly discarded. Without waiting for a single word of response or an attempt at an apology, Monique turned her back on the entire burning wreckage of the family. She grabbed her luxury handbag and physically ran down the center aisle of the courtroom, her high heels clicking frantically against the floor. She pushed violently through the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the chamber and sprinted completely out of the courthouse, desperate to escape the monumental financial blast radius, leaving DeAndre utterly abandoned to face his total destruction entirely alone. I sat perfectly still at the petitioner's table, completely untouched by the screaming, crying, and frantic running taking place just a few feet away from me. I did not break my cold professional composure. My highly aggressive divorce attorney Marcus was sitting beside me, his eyes wide with profound shock and absolute undeniable respect, as he watched the flawless execution of the most devastating legal trap he had ever witnessed in his entire career. He finally understood why I had remained so completely calm during the ambush at the mansion, and why I had so enthusiastically surrendered my corporate empire. I took another slow, deliberate sip from my water bottle, relishing the crisp, cool taste of total, absolute victory. The heavy wooden gavel finally slammed down repeatedly as the judge shouted for the bailiffs to restore order to his completely chaotic courtroom, but the damage was already permanently, legally, and beautifully done. Court was officially adjourned, and the absolute legal destruction of my ex-husband was fully cemented into the public record. I stood up from the petitioner's table, smoothing out the pristine fabric of my charcoal business suit. I did not look back at the sobbing, hyperventilating mother or the paralyzed, broken man who was currently being escorted out of the chamber by the court officers. I simply walked out of the heavy double doors into the bright midday sun, with Donovan walking perfectly in step beside me. There was absolutely no time to waste, because the financial execution had only just begun, and the physical liquidation of the holding company assets was scheduled to commence immediately. Later that exact same afternoon, the warm Atlanta sun was beating down on the pristine manicured lawns of my former $4 million estate. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with the peaceful, serene energy of old money and generational wealth. That quiet atmosphere was abruptly violently shattered when a fleet of 3 heavy-duty matte black utility vehicles pulled up to the massive wrought iron front gates. Donovan's highly aggressive corporate asset recovery team did not wait for an invitation. They did not press the intercom button to politely ask for entry. They possessed the absolute legal authority of a federal eviction mandate and the direct security override codes that I had willingly provided them. The heavy iron gates swung open smoothly, and the black vehicles drove aggressively up the long stone driveway, parking at strategic angles to completely block any potential exit paths. A highly trained team of 8 burly, ruthless recovery agents stepped out of the vehicles carrying heavy-duty power tools, commercial-grade lock-picking equipment, and thick stacks of federal legal notices. They moved with terrifying military precision, fanning out across the sprawling property to instantly secure every single entrance and exit. Within seconds, the agents were actively drilling through the custom mahogany front doors and violently replacing the expensive deadbolts with heavy commercial padlocks. Deep inside the sprawling, luxury guest wing of the mansion, Ebony and her freeloading, prejudiced husband Gavin were entirely oblivious to the catastrophic financial bomb that had just detonated downtown. They were both currently sleeping off massive hangovers from their week-long unearned celebration, sprawled lazily across my expensive imported linen sheets. They had spent the entire previous night drinking my rare vintage bourbon and laughing about how they had finally secured a lifetime of rent-free luxury living. Their comfortable, delusional slumber was violently interrupted when the heavy bedroom door was aggressively kicked open by 2 large recovery agents. The agents did not offer a polite wake-up call. They loudly ordered the terrified couple to immediately vacate the premises, announcing that the property had been legally seized by the private equity firm due to catastrophic commercial default. Gavin bolted upright in the bed, his pale face flushed with sudden drunken confusion and deeply ingrained arrogance. He was wearing nothing but a pair of cheap silk pajamas. He immediately puffed out his chest, attempting to use his usual obnoxious bravado to physically intimidate the massive recovery agents. He started yelling, slurring his words, as he aggressively demanded to know who gave them the authority to break into his private elite residence. He used his heavily coded prejudice language, telling the agents that they had no right to be in this exclusive zip code and threatening to call the local police to have them all arrested for breaking and entering. Gavin genuinely believed that his perceived social superiority would magically protect him from the harsh reality of corporate law. The lead recovery agent did not flinch. He did not argue or engage with the pathetic, screaming man. He simply reached into his dark suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents bearing the bright red stamp of a federal eviction mandate. He shoved the official paperwork directly into Gavin's chest, informing him with cold, terrifying indifference that the local police were actually currently waiting at the bottom of the driveway to ensure the eviction was carried out without any violent interference. The agent told Gavin that he had exactly 10 minutes to gather his basic personal necessities before he would be physically dragged off the property by force. The arrogant, unearned confidence completely violently drained out of Gavin's pale face. His jaw dropped open as he stared at the federal stamps, realizing with absolute horror that his luxurious free ride had just crashed directly into a concrete wall. Ebony began screaming and crying hysterically as the reality of their sudden homelessness crashed down upon her. She frantically scrambled out of the expensive bed, desperately trying to grab handfuls of the designer handbags and expensive jewelry she had purchased using my completely deactivated credit cards. The recovery agents strictly forbade them from taking anything that was not basic clothing, tossing a few cheap black garbage bags onto the bedroom floor and ordering them to pack quickly. 10 minutes later, the heavy front doors of the mansion swung open, and Ebony and Gavin were forcefully marched out into the blinding afternoon sun. They were still wearing their wrinkled silk pajamas, holding nothing but a few black garbage bags, filled with their pathetic belongings. The highly efficient recovery team physically escorted them down the long stone driveway, forcing them to walk the entire exhausting distance to the front gate. The absolute public humiliation was staggering. The wealthy elite neighbors who had been severely annoyed by DeAndre's loud, obnoxious barbecue the previous week were now standing on their pristine front lawns, watching the spectacular eviction unfold in broad daylight. The prominent doctors and legacy politicians of the neighborhood stared in open judgment as Gavin and Ebony were unceremoniously dumped onto the public curb outside the wrought iron gates. Ebony covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, as the wealthy women from the Homeowners Association whispered and pointed at their pathetic pajama-clad figures. Gavin stood there shivering in the afternoon breeze, clutching a black garbage bag full of dirty clothes, completely stripped of the fake high society prestige he had desperately tried to claim. They were entirely abandoned, locked out of the beautiful fortress they thought they had stolen. Just as the recovery team finished changing the final locks on the custom garage doors, a heavily dented taxicab pulled aggressively up to the curb. DeAndre stumbled out of the back seat, his custom-tailored royal blue suit completely wrinkled and his tie hanging loosely around his neck. He looked like a man who had just survived a horrific natural disaster. His eyes were wild and bloodshot, darting frantically from the heavy black utility vehicles parked in his driveway to the massive federal foreclosure notices currently being pasted directly onto the beautiful stone pillars of the front gate. He saw his sister and his brother-in-law sitting on the curb crying into their garbage bags, and the absolute staggering reality of his total financial ruin finally completely broke his mind. DeAndre sprinted toward the wrought iron gates, shaking the heavy metal bars and screaming for the recovery agents to stop what they were doing. He yelled that there must be a way to negotiate a settlement, that he was a powerful real estate CEO, and that he just needed a few more days to secure alternative funding. The recovery agents completely ignored his frantic, hysterical screams, treating him like a desperate trespasser. At that exact moment, Donovan's sleek black Bentley pulled smoothly up to the curb, coming to a gentle stop right behind the sobbing figures of Ebony and Gavin. The tinted window slowly rolled down, revealing my cold, utterly indifferent face. DeAndre saw me sitting comfortably in the luxurious leather seat of the expensive vehicle. He completely abandoned any remaining shred of his masculine pride or his fake billionaire persona. He dropped violently to his knees right there on the hard concrete driveway, surrounded by his weeping family members and the staring, judgmental eyes of his wealthy former neighbors. The man who had confidently demanded absolute ownership of my entire empire was now kneeling in the dirt, sobbing uncontrollably, his chest heaving with heavy, agonizing gasps for air. The tears streamed down his face, ruining his pristine appearance as he crawled desperately toward the open window of the Bentley. He reached out with trembling hands, begging me to stop the aggressive foreclosure process. He pleaded with me to call off Donovan's ruthless recovery team and save his beautiful mansion. He sobbed hysterically, claiming that he had been completely manipulated by everyone around him. He blamed Monique, telling me that the young Pilates instructor had aggressively seduced him and blinded his judgment. He violently threw his own mother under the bus, screaming that Brenda had pressured him into taking the massive toxic commercial loan so she could brag to her church friends. He cried that he never actually wanted the divorce, and that he had only demanded the holding company because his loud performative lawyer had aggressively pushed him into it. He sat there on his knees, desperately pointing his finger at every single person in his life, completely refusing to accept the fundamental reality that his own profound, unadulterated greed was the sole architect of his total destruction. DeAndre grabbed the edge of the open car window, begging for a second chance. He promised to do absolutely anything to fix his monumental mistake. He swore he would sign the holding company and the massive, catastrophic debt completely back over to me if I would just forgive him and let him back into the house. He cried that he loved me, that I was the only woman who truly understood his potential, and that he would spend the rest of his life making up for his horrific betrayal. He was practically hyperventilating, his voice cracking and pitching upward, as he delivered the most pathetic, desperate performance of his entire life right there on the public curb of the elite neighborhood he had tried to violently conquer. I sat perfectly still in the passenger seat of the luxurious black Bentley, watching the pathetic man outside my window completely unravel into a sobbing, hysterical mess. DeAndre was clutching the edge of the open car window, his knuckles turning white as he desperately tried to anchor himself to the very woman he had so arrogantly tried to destroy just a few days prior. The expensive royal blue suit he had worn to the courthouse was now stained with sweat and dirt from the driveway. His face was completely covered in a miserable mixture of tears and snot, completely ruining the handsome facade he had relied on for his entire adult life. He begged and pleaded, his voice cracking as he promised to do absolutely anything to reverse the catastrophic financial damage he had brought upon himself. He swore that he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me if I would just call off the private equity firm and save his fake real estate empire. I did not pull away from the window, and I did not break eye contact with him. I looked down at the man who had spent 3 years draining my bank accounts, disrespecting my boundaries, and allowing his toxic family to treat me like a disposable corporate machine. I searched my own heart for even a single microscopic drop of sympathy or lingering affection, but I found absolutely nothing. The space where my love for him used to reside was entirely empty, replaced by the cold, pristine clarity of absolute indifference. They had spent months trying to push me into becoming the stereotype of an angry, bitter black woman. They had desperately wanted me to scream and throw things so they could justify their profound cruelty and point their fingers at my supposed emotional instability. But as I looked down at DeAndre, groveling in the dirt, I realized I was not angry at all. Anger requires passion, and you do not waste passion on a severely depreciating asset. I kept my hands resting calmly in my lap and spoke in a smooth, level tone that easily cut through his pathetic sobbing. I told DeAndre that he needed to stop crying because his tears were completely useless in a business transaction. I told him that I was not the bitter, hysterical ex-wife he had so eagerly prepared himself to battle. I explained to him with the clinical detachment of a board member delivering a quarterly report that I was simply a highly effective corporate restructuring executive who had just successfully liquidated a remarkably toxic and unprofitable asset. I watched his bloodshot eyes widen as the sheer coldness of my words finally penetrated his delusional mind. I explained to him that our marriage was never a true partnership. It was a massive hostile liability draining my resources and threatening my long-term stability. I told him that when a visionary executive identifies a fatal leak in their corporate structure, they do not sit around crying and hoping the leak will magically fix itself. They surgically isolate the problem. They package the bad debt and they offload it onto a willing buyer who is too blinded by greed to read the fine print. I told DeAndre that he was the willing buyer. He had eagerly and enthusiastically purchased his own destruction the moment he signed those divorce papers and demanded absolute control of Apex Holdings, LLC. DeAndre shook his head wildly, continuing to sob as he tried to grasp my hands through the open window, but I calmly leaned back into the plush leather seat, moving entirely out of his reach. I told him that I did not destroy him. I simply stepped out of his way and allowed his own monumental arrogance and profound financial illiteracy to do all the heavy lifting. I informed him that I owed him absolutely no forgiveness and no salvation, because in the corporate world, you do not rescue a man who actively tries to steal your empire. You let him sink under the crushing weight of his own profound stupidity. Before DeAndre could offer another desperate, pathetic plea for mercy, the screeching sound of tires tearing against the pavement echoed down the quiet suburban street. A bright yellow taxicab pulled violently up to the curb, coming to an abrupt and chaotic stop right behind the fleet of matte black recovery vehicles. The rear door of the taxi flew open, and Brenda basically fell out onto the manicured lawn. The arrogant, toxic matriarch of the family looked like she had just survived a horrific natural disaster. Her extravagant, wide-brimmed church hat was completely skewed to the side, and her expensive matching suit was wrinkled and disheveled. She was clutching a crumpled stack of federal foreclosure papers in her trembling hands, her face streaked with heavy black mascara from crying uncontrollably all the way from the downtown courthouse. Brenda ignored the taxi driver who was yelling out the window for his unpaid fare. She stumbled across the green lawn, her eyes locking onto the pathetic, kneeling figure of her son. The realization of her absolute total ruin had completely shattered her mind. She had returned to her beautiful, fully paid-off suburban home, only to find Donovan's secondary asset recovery team already changing the locks and physically barring her from entering the property she had lived in for decades. She had lost her sanctuary, her community standing, and her entire life savings, all because she blindly backed her incompetent son's fake business venture. She let out a raw, agonizing scream that tore through the peaceful neighborhood. Brenda lunged forward, completely abandoning her fake high society elegance, and physically threw herself at DeAndre. She began hitting him with her heavy designer purse, slapping his shoulders and back as he continued to cower on the concrete driveway. She screamed at him, calling him a foolish, stupid boy who had completely ruined her life and left her homeless in her old age. DeAndre tried to raise his arms to protect himself from his mother's violent, hysterical blows, but he was too weakened by his own profound humiliation to fight back. He just curled into a tight, pathetic ball on the ground, sobbing loudly as his own mother beat him with her handbag in front of their wealthy former neighbors. The chaotic noise immediately drew the attention of Ebony and Gavin, who were still sitting on the public curb surrounded by their cheap black garbage bags. Seeing the matriarch of the family violently attacking the supposed billionaire real estate mogul caused the final remaining shreds of their family loyalty to completely evaporate. Gavin stood up from the curb, his pale face flushed with furious drunken indignation. He marched over to the chaotic scene and began screaming at DeAndre as well, blaming his brother-in-law for dragging them into this monumental disaster and leaving them completely stranded on the street without a roof over their heads. Ebony joined the screaming match, crying hysterically about her ruined designer clothes and demanding to know how they were going to survive without my credit cards funding their miserable lives. The entire family completely cannibalized itself right there on the pristine concrete driveway. They turned into a vicious, snarling pack of desperate animals, tearing each other apart as they frantically tried to assign blame for the catastrophic financial bomb that had just obliterated their existence. Brenda was screaming at DeAndre for losing her house. Gavin was cursing DeAndre for being a fake and a loser, and Ebony was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands as she realized her free ride was permanently over. They were a chaotic, humiliating mess of toxic entitlement and profound incompetence, rapidly drowning in the spectacular, devastating ashes of their own creation. I sat inside the quiet, cool sanctuary of the Bentley, watching the feral, screaming match unfold with absolute, perfect indifference. I did not offer a single word of intervention. I did not roll down the window to throw a petty insult or gloat about my flawless victory. I simply pressed the small silver button on the door panel, and the dark-tinted window slowly, smoothly rolled up, completely sealing off the chaotic noise of their pathetic destruction. The heavy, soundproof glass severed my final connection to their toxic world, leaving them to scream at each other in the warm afternoon sun, while I sat in absolute pristine silence. I turned my head and looked at Donovan, who was sitting behind the steering wheel watching the scene with a quiet, profound respect. He did not say a word, but the slow, knowing nod he offered me communicated everything that needed to be said. The contract was fully executed, the assets were securely liquidated, and the liabilities had been permanently successfully offloaded. The corporate restructuring of my personal life was officially complete. Donovan smoothly shifted the luxury vehicle into gear. The massive, powerful engine of the Bentley purred to life with a deep, resonant growl that vibrated gently through the floorboards. He checked his mirrors and slowly pulled the heavy car away from the curb, steering us gracefully down the long, tree-lined suburban street. I looked straight ahead through the clear windshield, watching the beautiful, affluent neighborhood pass by in a blur of green lawns and tall oak trees. I did not look back in the rearview mirror a single time. I had no desire to watch the family I had just legally destroyed tear themselves apart on the driveway of a mansion they would never step foot inside again. The afternoon sun was beginning to hang low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the city of Atlanta, as we drove smoothly onto the highway. I leaned back against the incredibly soft leather seat, feeling the gentle hum of the tires against the pavement. My mind was completely clear, my bank accounts were fully secured, and my entire future was an open blank canvas, waiting for me to build a brand new empire, completely free of parasites and dead weight. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, deep breath of the cool, conditioned air, feeling an overwhelming sense of untouchable, absolute peace. I had walked through the fire they tried to burn me with, and I had emerged completely unbothered, leaving them entirely trapped in the inescapable inferno they had so eagerly built for themselves. The ultimate lesson from this story is the undeniable power of knowing your worth and keeping your composure when dealing with toxic people, when others try to belittle your hard work or take advantage of your success. Reacting with explosive anger only gives them exactly what they want. Instead, you should protect your peace, set unbreakable boundaries, and quietly focus on your own growth. True strength is not about fighting every single battle out loud. It is about being incredibly smart, understanding your true value, and calmly walking away from those who disrespect you. Build your own independent future and never let anyone steal your peace. If you believe in standing up for your self-worth and leaving toxic energy behind, hit the like button and share your own empowering story in the comments below.